Us this morning. Barbara really needs no introduction. I think you've probably been in a cave somewhere if you lived around here, participated in ILR and other programs in the Gainesville community, and haven't heard at least one of her presentations. She is remarkable in terms of her knowledge of not only American history, but women in American history, which is more or less her specialty. She's a professor emeritus from Santa Fe. In fact, we will be doing a program with some faculty from Santa Fe in the spring, and she was actually their, I guess you would say, their boss for a while. Her presentation this morning is sweeping in terms of Shirley Chisolm. It wasn't until I sat down and started really reviewing her presentation for today that I realized how broad and intense Shirley Chisholm's career was. I mean, it's truly a remarkable career. And as you probably all know, those of you at least who have watched the debates and watched the swearing in of Biden and Harris, there were kudos given to Shirley by a number of people who are making possible the first vice president of the United States, first female vice president of the United States. So she certainly continues to be recognized. And with that introduction, I'll turn this over to Barbara.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Let me share my screen. No, we don't want that. Just 2 weeks ago, as Ellen was referencing, the first female vice president in the United States was sworn into office. Kamala Harris, not only the first woman, but the first African American, the first Asian American, breaking glass ceilings and making history on several fronts. She wore purple. I suspect a lot of you noticed it. Not only did she wear purple, but Elizabeth Warren wore purple, Hillary Clinton wore purple, Laura Bush wore purple, Jill Biden wore purple the night before. Why purple? Perhaps as a statement of unity, a combination of Republican red and Democratic blue. Perhaps a nod to the suffrage movement, whose colors were purple, white, and yellow. Or perhaps, most likely, paying homage to the woman who the vice president said had, quote, created a path for her. None other than Shirley Chisolm. And Shirley Chisolm often used purple as her campaign color. Harris's presidential campaign logo was for the people, an acknowledgement of Chisholm's own campaign. In a speech in 2019, Vice President Harris noted that Chisholm was powerful, extraordinary, and courageous. She went on to say, Chisholm reminds me of the many sayings of my mother. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. That was Shirley Chisolm. I stand, as so many of us do, on her shoulders, unquote. But for a long time, after she left Congress in 1983 and after her death in 2005, there was very little written about her. One writer called it a period of hibernation. But in the last few years, with so many women running for elective office, and the recognition of Black women as a powerful political force, there has been a renewed attention and interest in this remarkable woman. When the 91st Congress of the United States convened on January 3rd, 1969, there was a newly elected member, Shirley Chisolm, the first African-American Congresswoman. She was running late getting to that first session of Congress. The roll had been called and she rushed in wearing her coat and hat. Immediately, she was told she was breaking a rule. Shirley Chisolm would write later that she was amazed, astounded at the lack of decorum. Members were walking around, they were slapping each other's backs, they were talking without paying attention to the proceedings. She was shocked at what she called the din that drowned out the speaker and men giving speeches. Of course, many of the men took time to come up to her and ask, "Well, what does your husband think about this?" They were joking, but the implication was there. There were only 10 women in Congress, and she was the first African-American woman. Nonetheless, Shirley Chisolm took the House by storm, and her remarkable foray into American politics was launched. Shirley Anita St. Hill Chisolm was born in Brooklyn on November 20th, 1924. When she was 3, she was sent to Barbados to live with her grandmother, who is pictured here showing Shirley when she was just an infant. She went there with her 2 sisters. The family did not have a lot of resources, and they felt they did not have enough money to really raise 3 daughters well. So off they went to the Barbados, and Shirley would later write that the strict British style of schooling and their traditional approach was excellent training, particularly in speaking and writing easily. It also left her with a clipped British accent, which often amused people who listened to her in later life. Shirley's father, Charles, only had a 5th grade education. He was a factory worker at a burlap factory, originally from Guyana, and then emigrated to the Barbados. But he was a voracious reader. Shirley recalls that he would buy several newspapers a day. And even if he saw a man passing out a handbill across the street, he would cross the street to get it and read it. He made his daughters read the articles in the newspapers. Each one had to choose an article, and then they would discuss them at supper. He was deeply involved in politics. Her mother, Ruby, was a seamstress and a domestic worker, and she enforced also very good study habits on those daughters. She wanted, as Shirley later wrote, her daughters to become poised, modest, accomplished, educated, graceful, prepared to take our place in the world. Shirley, after a rough start in elementary school because she had not had American history and geography and was put back several grades, once she caught up, she excelled and went on to girls' high school in the Bedford-Stuyvesant district of Brooklyn. Girls High School is a very famous high school. It was highly regarded as having an excellent education. It was integrated in many ways with students from all over. And Shirley excelled as a student. She was a marvelous debater, so much so that she won scholarships to both Vassar and Oberlin, but chose instead to go to Brooklyn College because of financial considerations. Brooklyn College was a period of growth for her. She majored in sociology and Spanish. She trained to become a teacher because she wanted to better society, and she believed she could better society by being a teacher and helping people. And she joined various clubs. One of them was called Ipothea. I love it. It means in pursuit of the highest in all. And it was a club for African-American students. If you look carefully, you will see Shirley in the third row, fifth from the left. There she is, smiling. She also joined the Harriet Tubman Society, and the Harriet Tubman Society at Brooklyn College protested segregation. This is during the period of World War II, and they protested particularly segregation in the American Armed Forces. This is the example of one of the flyers distributed by Shirley Chisolm. Her graduation photo from Brooklyn College in 1946. She graduated with honors and then went looking for a job. Her political science professor, her favorite political science professor, had suggested she go into politics because she was so good at public speaking. But she said to him, quote, "You forget two things. I'm Black and I'm a woman." She had some difficulty actually getting a job as a teacher because she was tiny, 5 feet 2 inches, barely 90 pounds. And many of the people who interviewed her thought she simply looked too young. Eventually, she did get a job, several jobs in nursery schools and child care centers, and worked her way up as director of the Friends Day Nursery in Brooklyn, going to school at night at Columbia and earning a master's in elementary education. Here she is as a young woman during this time. While she was at Columbia, she met a graduate student from Jamaica, Conrad Chisholm. They were married in 1949. It was a good marriage as long as it lasted, and he would be very supportive of Shirley Chisholm's efforts into the political arena. From 1959 to 1964, Shirley worked as an educational consultant in the daycare division of New York City's Bureau of Child Welfare. But she also joined the League of Women Voters and the Bedford-Stuyvesant Political League. She was, from the beginning, concerned that there weren't enough women in elective positions in the various organizations, the political organizations associated particularly with the Democratic Party. So in 1960, she helped found something called the Democratic Unity Club, whose goal was to take over the 17th Assembly District from the political machine and make sure that it was more representative of minorities and women. In 1964, suddenly there was an opening for a new assemblyman from the 17th District. Shirley decided to run. She would be running for the New York State Assembly. This was a hard-fought contest. She hired a truck that roamed through the streets. She would get up there and shout, "This is fighting Shirley Chisolm coming your way." And she would go to housing projects and speak to various parts of the neighborhood. It, as I said, was a hard-fought campaign, and she won by a large margin and took her place in the New York State Assembly. Here's a wonderful picture of her checking political statistics. I cannot tell you what those statistics are or what they stand for, but as soon as she came to the New York State Assembly, she was very, very active. She earned a reputation as being outspoken, perhaps a little militant, but she was not afraid to speak out for things that were important to her. Two of the bills she sponsored that passed, that she was very proud of, were unemployment insurance for domestic and personal employees, and something called the SEEK program. The SEEK program allowed disadvantaged young people to go to college with special help. And of course, education was always very, very important to her. In 1968, the Supreme Court ordered the redistricting and redrawing of the 12th Congressional District of New York. Now, this district had been gerrymandered and split up so that minority voters never were able to elect their candidates and didn't have much of an influence. With the redrawing of the map, Black voters would now have much more of an impact. So when the court ordered this reapportionment, Shirley decided that she would run for the congressional seat. She was the choice of the Citizens Committee, but it was a hard-fought Democratic primary fight. She did win, and then she began to campaign. This is a very typical campaign poster, the People's Choice, a vote for Shirley Chisolm, a vote for an unbossed congressman of the people and for the people. A typical statement. My 12th congressional district of Brooklyn is composed of poor neighborhoods with all the problems of poverty in an aggregated form. Slum housing, high unemployment, too few medical services, high crime rates, neglected schools, the whole list. About 69% of my people are Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian, and Italian. Speaking for them at this moment in history is a great responsibility because they have been unrepresented and ignored for so long, and their needs are so many and so urgent. Now, in this campaign, and here she is voting on November 5th, 1968, her opponent was James Farmer. You might recognize the name. James Farmer was a nationally known civil rights activist. He had helped to found the Congress of Racial Equality. He had gone on freedom rides and freedom marches in the South. He was closely connected to Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. He was highly respected. He was running as a liberal candidate, but he was also supported by the Republican Party. He was well-financed and well-staffed, but he made a crucial mistake. He introduced the issue of gender into this election. At one point, he said, the 12th district needed to be represented by a man, not, quote, a little school teacher, unquote. You can imagine how Shirley Chisolm reacted to that. And you also have to know that the 12th district contained a lot of women voters. They were not pleased at farmers' statements, and Shirley Chisolm won in what was considered an upset victory by a 2-to-1 margin. Here she is giving the victory sign on election night. She said, quote, "Just wait, there may be some fireworks," unquote. Of course, she attracted a lot of attention. Here she is on the cover of both Ebony and Jet magazine. When she was interviewed by the Washington Post, she stated, "I am a historical person at this point, and I'm very much aware of it." As I said, she was the first Black woman in Congress. There were less than 10 women in all of Congress total. She said, "I have no intention of sitting quietly and observing." That's what freshman congressmen are supposed to do. "I intend to focus attention on the nation's problems." And she did. This is the first speech that Shirley Chisolm gave in Congress, and she didn't mince words. It was a criticism of the Vietnam War. Unless we start to fight and defeat the enemies in our own country, poverty and racism, and made our talks of equality and opportunity ring true, we are exposed in the eyes of the world when we talk about making people free. How right she was. The United States, supposedly bringing freedom around the world, but there wasn't freedom in our own country. Shirley Chisolm would be reelected for 7 terms to Congress. She would serve from 1969 to 1983. And the first committee she was assigned was the Agriculture Committee. That made her furious, coming from an urban district of New York. Agriculture? Her sarcastic comment was, quote, "Apparently all they know here in Washington about Brooklyn is that a tree grew there," unquote. She was upset, furious really, but she did use her position in positive ways to work for increases in the food stamp program and help for infants and mothers. But she challenged the whole seniority system and directly talked to the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, who handed out the assignments. Eventually, she would be reassigned to the Veterans Committee. She said, "Good, there are more veterans than trees in Brooklyn." The Education and Labor Committee. And she would end up, toward the end of her career, on the Rules Committee, being the first woman in that position. While she was in Congress, she campaigned for the things that were near and dear to her, including minimum wage increases, provisions for housing, labor, immigration. She was concerned about protecting Sioux land, and she worked with Bella Abzug on a very extensive bill that would provide federal subsidies for daycare centers. Unfortunately, even though this bill passed both the House and Senate, it was vetoed by President Nixon. She was critical, very critical, and outspoken about the workings of Washington. and brought out a book in 1970 that took its title from her campaign, Unbought and Unbossed. She said that Congress was too clubby and unresponsive. Quote, "Our representative democracy is not working because the Congress that is supposed to represent the voters does not respond to their needs. I believe the chief reason for this is that it is ruled by a small group of old men." A small group of old men. Those are fire-eating words from this woman. And of course, in many ways, she was right. She helped to found the Congressional Black Caucus, shown here in 1971, so that Black members of Congress could make their needs known. Another picture. Notice Shirley Chisolm. Hard to miss her, sitting there amidst all the men. She also helped to found the National Women's Political Caucus. I would suspect that many of you will recognize the other people in this photo. Bella Abzug standing, Gloria Steinem on the left, and Betty Friedan on the right. She was concerned about women's rights, helped to sponsor the Equal Rights Amendment, and she was anxious to get more women elected. This was her reasoning. Quote, "The law cannot do the major job of winning equality for women. Women must do it themselves. They must become revolutionaries. In particular, I am certain that more and more American women must become involved in politics. It could be the salvation of our nation." Incredible words from Shirley Chisolm. This is the kind of newsletter that she put out while she was in Congress. I know it's probably difficult for you to read, but she listed all the bills that she had sponsored. And of course, they had to do with children, the aged, health, education, immigration, consumer issues, the kinds of things that she had always been interested in. In January of 1972, at Concord Baptist Church, Shirley Chisolm announced that she was going to run for the Democratic nomination for the president. She said, "I stand here not as a Black woman, although I am proud to be a Black woman. I stand here as the candidate of the people." It shocked some people, many people actually, when Shirley Chisolm announced her run for the presidency. It had not actually been that well planned. She hadn't talked to many of the people and the Black Political Caucus, or the National Women's Political Movement. So it came as somewhat of a shock. She had hoped to forge a coalition behind her of feminists and Black interests, but it really didn't happen. There are complex reasons for this. As you know, presidential elections and presidential primaries and presidential conventions are always very complicated. She herself would later admit that her campaign was disorganized and underfinanced. Can you believe she only had $300,000 to spend on this presidential campaign? But she wanted to make a point. And the point was that the presidency wasn't just for white men. The presidency, the highest office in the land, could also be for women and a Black woman. She campaigned in many states. She was on the primary ballot, or won votes in 14. Interviewed constantly. Here she is being interviewed by Sherry Henry on the CBS program at that time that was called Woman, ! In March of 1972. And she was always asked, quote, "Are you a serious candidate?" Unquote. Translation, you have to be crazy to think you could do this. But she was a serious candidate. She made no bones about her opposition to the Vietnam War, which had been there for a very long time. And I love this. Before the National Press Club in May of 1972, she denounced the rationale for the increased bombing in Vietnam, which Nixon had initiated as, quote, harebrained gibberish, unquote. Here she is on Meet the Press. You can see McGovern, Humphrey, and Muskie in the background, and Shirley Chisolm. Her husband, Conrad, giving her lots of support as she campaigned. Her campaign poster, using unbought and unbossed again, bring us together, bring the United States together. I like that slogan. And a collection of Shirley Chisolm campaign buttons. The one in the middle, I am a catalyst for change. How true. The one on the far right, at the top, take the Chisholm Trail to 1600 President Pennsylvania Avenue. Shirley Chisolm unbought and unbossed. Here are Chisholm supporters cheering at the Democratic National Convention in July of 1972. It was held in Miami. Some of you may remember that. Here she is speaking at the convention. She won 10% of the votes. That's 152 delegate votes. Certainly not enough to get the nomination, but enough to make an impact on the Democratic platform. She wrote later that she did have an influence on the Democratic platform in terms of what was said about women's rights and civil rights. When she talked about her experience running for president, Chisolm would always say that she met more discrimination being a woman than being a Black, that there were many people in the Democratic Party, and in fact in politics, who thought that women did not belong in the highest offices. And so for her, the campaign was serious and symbolic to pave the way for the future. George McGovern emerged as the Democratic candidate, no surprise. And here she is congratulating him and actually casting a vote for him in 1972. Shirley Chisolm would choose not to run for re-election in 1983. As I mentioned earlier, she left Congress. She felt that the climate had changed, and she also had personal reasons for leaving. She and Conrad had divorced, and she had married her second husband, Arthur Hardwick, in 1977. He was seriously injured in a car accident, and she wanted to devote more time to taking care of him. She said, "I've been so consumed by my life in politics. I have no time for privacy from my husband, no time to play my beautiful grand piano." Nonetheless, she remained active. And in 1984, she helped to found something which is still important today, the National Congress of Black Women. This was established during the vice presidential campaign of Geraldine Favaro, and Chisholm would be the first chair. She also campaigned heavily for Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988. She taught at Mount Holyoke College. And then in 1991, she moved to Ormond Beach, Florida, which allowed us to bring her here as the speaker at our annual Friends of Susan B. Anthony luncheon in August of 2000. Some of you may know that I am active in this organization. The Friends of Susan B. Anthony is a volunteer organization which every year in August honors Women's Equality Day, the official day that women were given, not given, granted the right to vote. And we always have a speaker and an honoree. Well, Shirley Chisolm was our speaker that year, and I had the great good fortune of sitting next to her. This is a cherished picture. I do not have the one when she leaned over and kissed me. Unfortunately, my husband did not get that photo. But I must tell you, it was an experience being with Shirley Chisolm. She and I are about the same height. I'm a little under 5'2", and she was 5'2", and I brought her up to the podium to speak. Now there I was in my usual Florida sandals, and there was Shirley Chisolm wearing 5-inch white heels to go with that white suit. And getting her up on that podium was no small task. She gave, of course, an absolutely marvelous speech about women in politics, and we were very, very lucky to have her. Shirley Chisolm died in 2005, and since that time there have been various honors, a stamp in her honor, the Medal of Freedom given to her posthumously, and very recently, an incredible park that has opened up in Jamaica Bay, New York, one of the largest parks in the New York system. It opened just a few years ago. It's not totally complete, but it has this wonderful mural of Shirley Chisolm. And of course, lots of information about her if you walk along its pathways. There is another park, an incredible park, that is on the drawing board to be built in Brooklyn. Here is an aerial view of the monument, the proposed monument to Shirley Chisolm. This is what it's going to look like if it is actually built. Another view. So this one is in the works. One of my favorite renditions of Shirley Chisolm is from a new children's book that Ellen discovered, just published last year. Shirley Chisolm is a verb. I think that's perfect. And this is my favorite portrait. This is the one that hangs in the US Capitol. It is a portrait, an incredible portrait of Chisolm by Kadir Nelson, done in 2008. Now look carefully. You will see that Shirley Chisolm has her finger raised because she has something to say to you, to tell you. And this is what it is. In the end, anti-Black, anti-female, and all forms of discrimination are equivalent to the same thing: anti-humanism. A personal favorite: if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. You don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. And this one, this wonderful one. I want history to remember me not just as the first Black woman to be elected to Congress, not as the first Black woman to have made a bid for the presidency of the United States, but as a Black woman who lived in the 20th century and dared to be herself. Racism is so universal in this country, so widespread and deep-seated, that it is invisible because it is so normal. How much that statement resonates today. I am and always will be a catalyst for change. There is little place in the political scheme of things for an independent creative personality, for a fighter. Anyone who takes that role must pay a price. And again, I hope if I am remembered, it will finally be for what I have done, not for what I happen to be. And I hope that my having made it the hard way can be some kind of inspiration, particularly to women. I'd like them to say that Shirley Chisolm had guts. Yes, I think we can say that Shirley Chisolm had guts. She was a trailblazer, a political trailblazer who shattered gender and racial stereotypes. She was outspoken. She was charismatic. She was controversial. And she was an inspiration for many women. Thank you very much.
Barbara, that was terrific. I don't know how you captured all these pictures, but they are truly wonderful.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I want to get rid of the PowerPoint, and I will close it out so I can take questions.
Well, these are absolutely wonderful, and they do tell the entire story of Chisholm's career. And, you know, I'm sort of embarrassed to say I did not know about that park in New York.
Well, I only found out about it myself recently.
Well, you know, I came from there, so I should know, but it looks absolutely beautiful. Let's take questions. Put them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, Rick Gold was the first one up, so go ahead and unmute, Rick.
Thanks, Barbara. It was just absolutely fantastic presentation. I'm wondering if you could expand on her African-American identity. Certainly, she did amazing things for women in terms of inspiring them, in terms of being the first in many areas. However, she identified herself as a Black woman. When we talk of the mutual identities and mutual oppressions, what did she learn from the Black side of her identity, and what did she do to advance it, recognizing that she was also an oppressed woman?
An interesting question, Rick. I mean, she did obviously identify as a Black woman. And she was very conscious of her Black identity. You saw that she helped to found the Black Congressional Caucus and then the National Women's Black Conference. She wanted to advance the issues that affected Black people, and particularly in her district. So she was very proud of that, but she wanted to be considered on her merits as an individual who was in politics and had things to say. So but there's no doubt that her Black identity was very, very important to her. And, you know, one of the things that James Farmer had said during that 1968 campaign was, oh, Black women have always been in control. You know, we need a man's voice in Congress. And of course, she just bristled at that idea. So yes, I think her Black identity was very important, and she felt particularly strongly about the Vietnam War because, as you know, Black Americans were overrepresented in the soldiers that we sent to the Vietnam War. And so that was an issue for her, for sure.
All right, we do have one from chat. It says, what would Shirley Chisholm think about women's political progress since her active days?
She would say, yay. She would love it. Absolutely love it. I think the ghost of Shirley Chisholm is watching very carefully, and she's thrilled at all the women who are running for politics, and she's thrilled at all the Black women who are becoming involved in politics. I think she would absolutely love it. I mean, this is what she wanted, and we've had to wait, what, 50 years? I mean, over 50 years. She appeared in Congress in 1968, so it's over 50 years. And, you know, what she found in Congress in 1968 was literally a white man's club.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the way Congress was. There were very few Black representatives in Congress. There were very few women in Congress. It was in many ways a white man's club. And she wanted to change that, and it certainly has changed. I think she would be absolutely thrilled. And when Kamala Harris and everyone else says they stand on the shoulders of Shirley Chisholm, those tiny little shoulders, they are right. They're absolutely right. I mean, she would say someone had to be the first. It is always difficult to be the first. It takes guts, it takes courage, and she had it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Alice Gridley, go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. That was a fantastic presentation. And the point, and you just mentioned it, the point that I wanted to make is it really brought home the fact that we don't always have to win the campaign in order to make a huge difference at a later point. And you really brought that out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you make, Alice. I mean, obviously she didn't win the Democratic nomination in 1972, but she paved the way. You know, she paved the way for Jesse Jackson to make a serious run. She paved the way for Geraldine Ferraro to be on the ticket, and she paved the way in many aspects for Kamala Harris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shirley, go ahead.
Hi, Barbara. That was so terrific. And I love it. I have a namesake kind of connection since I'm Shirley also. And I grew up in Brooklyn, and I spent my early years in Prospect Park. I know exactly how bad the neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant was when she was going to school. But I wonder, times were different then. But is there a backstory of her being threatened? Was there any potential for them taking her out? You know, times are not, maybe they're not like they are today, but what was going on in the background?
Yeah, it's a good question, Shirley. Thanks for asking it. There were threats on her life during the campaign of 1972. There were several definite threats. And at one point, a man came toward her with a knife, but he was, taken care of. She received some hate mail. There were campaign posters and flyers that mysteriously disappeared, things like that. But yeah, she doesn't talk about that a lot, but there definitely was negative reaction to her campaign, and there were some threats. But her husband, Conrad Chisholm, I didn't mention this, he was a private detective, and he was a pretty big guy, and he was there with her most of the time.
Did she get much harassment from the Black members of Congress? Did they support her? How did they treat her?
Well, they supported her when she arrived in '68, but '72 was a different story, because politics is a strange game. And one of the things you want in politics is leverage. So many of the Black members of the Black Congressional Caucus felt that their best chance was to support McGovern. And then they would have leverage later for appointments, for the platform, etc. And so it was a great disappointment to her that many members of that Black caucus and did not endorse her, did not support her. But as I said, politics is not simple, and you want to support the winning candidate. Even Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem were kind of half-hearted in their endorsement, because they wanted to be on the side of the winning candidate.
As you
So
say, politics is not for wimps, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was criticism for her. It was like, you don't belong here. You're an intruder. What are you doing? And you're making things difficult for us.
Right. Wow, thanks so much, Barbara.
Thank you. Go ahead, Barb.
Yeah, it was wonderful, Barbara. Thank you so much. There's so much I didn't know that you've just given to me in an easy manner. I just wanted to point out, to emphasize something, which, as a biologist, I know she was honored for starting the WIC program. And I know she, even when she was in the agriculture committee, she did something. I mean, actually, Rabbi Schneerson, the Orthodox rabbi, asked to speak to her, and they conjured up this thing, and he said, but there's, you can do something here. And then she started the WIC program, and using the leftovers in agriculture to give it. And I just think wherever she was, she made the best of it and did the best for everyone. And I wish she were here now.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's very interesting when she campaigned in churches and streets and synagogues, and when she was put on the agriculture committee and she complained about it particularly, as Barb has pointed out, to a very prominent Orthodox rabbi. And he said to her, well, if you're on the agriculture committee, perhaps you can do something for women and children. And she was important in getting this WIC program, which is women, infants, and children, expanded, and having surplus milk and other supplies used for that program. So you're absolutely right about that. But I think I was amused when I read about her conversation with Rabbi Schneerson.
All right, Ellen, back to you.
Barbara, I have a question. How would Shirley have thought about how long it took the United States vis-a-vis our other, the other industrialized countries to elect, putting aside the issue of a Black woman, but to elect a woman to one of the highest positions in the country. Most of the other industrialized countries do not think twice about doing so. They've elected chancellors and presidents and premiers and all of that. And we certainly, I mean, look at where we are. We're in 2021, and this is the first time we've elected a woman to serve as the second, not even the first, the second highest position in this country. How would she feel about that?
I think she would be both discouraged in a sense that it took so long and realistic. Remember what she said, that she always faced more discrimination as a woman than as a Black person. She was very conscious of discrimination against women in the United States, and she realized how deep-rooted it was. So I think she would realistically understand that it was going to take a long time in our system.
And it certainly did.
It did. Too long.
Too long.
Too long.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Barbara?
I looked down and 2 more hands went up. Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, Barbara, thank you for that presentation. I learned some things that I didn't know as usual from you. I was curious, of our wonderful Black women in Congress at the moment, who do you think is most like her, or how many of them are? I sort of had some in mind. I want to see who you think.
I'd have a hard time choosing. I really would, Holly. Who is your nominee?
Well, you know who reminds me most recently and for the last several years is Val Demings from Florida, who I think just doesn't get enough credit for who she really is and what she's done in her career. I'm so happy that she's there, but she reminds me of some of these traits and ways that, and how she presents herself. You know, she's so good at that. She doesn't like overreact, you know, and gets many points across. And the white men seem to listen to her, which is a novel concept.
Yeah, she is a very, very effective speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Val Demings, one of the most effective speakers. And so perhaps in that sense, she's like Shirley Chisolm. Shirley Chisolm was an absolutely charismatic speaker. There's no doubt about it. And as petite as she was, you know, with the 5-inch heels, she made an impression when she spoke. But that's interesting, Val Demings. I'll have to think about it a little more. I mean, there's so many women who are outstanding. In many ways, the woman who reminds me the most of her, who isn't in Congress, is Stacey Abrams.
Oh, yeah. Well, Stacey. Maybe we'll see her there someday. Maybe she'll be the first woman president.
Sherry Dupree, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I did. I just wanted to say that I did not know her personally, and I remember when she came to Gainesville in 2000. I couldn't attend that day, but I do remember that activity. She was a Zeta Phi Beta. I'm a Zeta also when you look at sororities. And she used a lot of Zora Neale Hurston's mannerisms in her talk and actions. And I know we're all familiar with Zora and the changing the roles of women and speaking out. Zora was very outspoken and very opinionated. And I believe a lot of that went into the role of dealing with how she presented herself, especially toward Black audiences. She could bring herself right down to who they were, how they acted and everything. And then she could turn around the next second and talk to presidents, queens, and whoever. And that's a special gift that some people don't have, that are able to move from one culture to another culture and yet fit in. So I just wanted to share that.
Oh, that's a wonderful comment. Thank you so much, Sherry. And you know, while I'm thinking of it, you can watch a movie called Unbought and Unbossed on YouTube. And it's a movie, a documentary about her 1972 presidential run. And she's interviewed. And there are, wonderful shots of her and comments as she's watching the delegates and all of that. I highly recommend it. If I had been more technologically adept, I could have played a clip of Shirley Chisolm, but it's one of the things that I haven't yet mastered, I must admit.
You did a wonderful job. I'm very impressed.
Well, thank you, Sherry.
Very, very impressive. It was
Thank you,
extremely
comments.
nice. Thank you.
All right, well,
Shirley, did you have another question? Shirley?
I was going to ask, did I remember that you saying that there was some point in time that Shirley Chisholm said that women would save the country or save the world or something? As wonderful as men are, there must be kind of an elimination of some of the testosterone eventually, if we're going to save the world, perhaps.
I don't know what I'm supposed to comment to that, Shirley.
I'm just planting a seed for you, Barbara.
Well, she did say that at one point, I quoted her, that women would be our salvation. And there's no doubt about women introduce different issues and a different mindset into politics. And that's good. It's really good.
Thank you, Barbara.
Anyone else? Barbara, thank
a
you
great
so
talk.
much. It was a